Part 1. Hand 7 had worked for the Intergalactic Tourism Board for 300 years. In that time, she had seen things that most beings could only dream about. She had floated through the crystal caves of Andromeda Prime, where the walls sang in frequencies that could make a stone weep. She had watched the triple sunset of 442b paint an entire ocean in colors that had no names. She had stood on the edge of the singing cliffs of Vega 9, where the wind itself told stories of ancient wars and lost loves. Nothing surprised her anymore, or so she thought. It started with a routine assignment. The tourism board required surveys of all inhabited worlds, even the small and unimportant ones. Earth was one such world, a tiny blue planet in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy, home to a species that had only recently discovered space travel. The humans, as they called themselves, were not considered particularly interesting. They had no natural telepathy. They could not photosynthesize. They lived remarkably short lives, and spent most of that time arguing with each other about things that seemed unimportant. Hand 7 sent her junior analyst, a young named Pip, to conduct the survey. It was supposed to be simple. Catalog the planet's natural features, assess any potential tourist attractions, file the report, move on. Pip was gone for 3 of Earth's months. When he returned, Hand 7 barely recognized him. Pip was which meant he had a soft body covered in pale blue skin, 3 eye stalks that could move independently, and a nervous disposition that made him ideal for careful, detailed work. Were known for their calm demeanor and their love of order. They did not get excited. They did not raise their voices. They certainly did not vibrate with enthusiasm so intense that their eye stalks tangled together. But that was exactly what Pip was doing when he burst into Hand 7's office. "You have to see this," he said. His voice was higher than usual. "You have to see what they do." Hand 7 leaned back in her chair. She had seen many young analysts return from their first surveys with inflated ideas about what they had discovered. It was part of the job. She would listen politely, explain why whatever they had found was not actually that remarkable, and send them on their way. "Show me," she said. Pip activated his recording device and projected the images onto the wall of her office. At first, Hand 7 did not understand what she was seeing. There was a vast desert, dry and empty under a burning sun, and in the middle of this desert, thousands upon thousands of humans had gathered. They had built structures out of wood and metal and fabric. Strange structures, beautiful structures, structures that served no practical purpose whatsoever. And at the center of it all stood a massive wooden figure, taller than any of the temporary buildings around it. "What is this?" Hand 7 asked. "They call it Burning Man," Pip said. "Watch." As she watched, the sun set over the desert. The humans began to gather around the wooden figure. They were dressed in costumes that description. Some wore almost nothing. Others wore elaborate outfits that seemed to be made of light itself. They were dancing. They were singing. They were hugging strangers and sharing food and painting each other's bodies with colors that glowed in the darkness. And then they set the wooden figure on fire. Hand 7 watched the flames climb higher and higher. She watched the humans dance around the fire, their faces lit by the orange glow, their voices raised in sounds that might have been songs or might have been screams of joy. The wooden figure collapsed in a shower of sparks, and the humans cheered as if they had witnessed something magnificent. "They built it just to burn it," Pip said. "They spent months building it, knowing they were going to destroy it. They traveled across their entire planet just to watch it burn, and they were happy. They were so happy." Hand 7 said nothing. She was still trying to process what she had seen. Pip changed the projection. Now she was looking at a city packed with beings so tightly that movement seemed impossible, but they were moving. They were dancing through the streets, riding on massive platforms decorated with flowers and feathers and mirrors. The sound of drums filled the air. Everyone was wearing bright colors. Everyone was smiling. "This is called Carnival," Pip said. It happens every year in a place called They Dance for Days. They barely sleep. They wear costumes that take months to create, costumes that weigh more than they do, and they dance until their feet bleed, and then they keep dancing. The projection changed again. This time Hand 7 saw a city at night, but it was not dark. Every building, every street, every surface was covered in lights. Tiny flames flickered in windows and on rooftops. Larger fires burned in public squares. The sky itself seemed to glow with the reflection of a million small lights. Diwali, Pip said, the festival of lights. They celebrate the victory of light over darkness. Every year they transform their cities into galaxies. They become the stars. Again the projection changed. Now she saw humans running through narrow streets, chased by large animals with sharp horns. "This is dangerous," she said. "Very dangerous," Pip agreed. "People get hurt every year. Sometimes they die. They do it anyway. They call it the running of the bulls." The projections kept coming. Humans throwing colored powder at each other until the air itself became a rainbow. Humans launching paper lanterns into the night sky until the darkness was full of floating lights. Humans gathering by the millions to watch mechanical flowers bloom over their cities in explosions of light and sound. "They celebrate everything," Pip said. His voice had grown quiet now, almost reverent. "They celebrate the changing of seasons. They celebrate the harvest of crops. They celebrate the birth of their children and the death of their ancestors. They celebrate the end of wars and the beginning of new years. They celebrate for no reason at all, just because the sun is shining or the rain has stopped or they are alive and together." Hand 7 sat in silence for a long time. On the wall, the projections continued to cycle through image after image of human celebration. A winter festival where they dragged trees inside their homes and covered them in lights. A spring festival where they painted eggs in bright colors and hid them for children to find. A harvest festival where they carved faces into orange vegetables and pretended to be monsters. It was chaos. It was inefficient. It was completely and utterly illogical. And it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "The tourism board has nothing like this," she said finally. "No," Pip agreed. "No one does." Hand 7 stood up. She walked to the window of her office and looked out at the orderly streets of the tourism board's headquarters. Everything was clean and efficient. Every building served a purpose. Every activity had been optimized for maximum satisfaction with minimum waste. And suddenly it all seemed very empty. "We need to promote this," she said. "All of it. Every festival, every celebration, every moment of human joy. The galaxy needs to see this." Pip's eye stalks straightened in surprise. "All of it? There are thousands of festivals, tens of thousands. Every culture on their planet has its own celebrations. We could not even catalog them all." "Then we start with the biggest ones," Hand 7 said, "and we expand from there." She turned back to face her junior analyst. "Submit the proposal. Earth's festival calendar is now a priority attraction." Pip hesitated. "The board will have questions. They will want to know about safety protocols, cultural sensitivity guidelines, accommodation requirements for non-human physiology." "Let them ask," Hand 7 said. "We will figure it out. This is too important to ignore." She looked back at the projections still cycling on her wall. A group of humans were lifting a small child onto their shoulders so the child could see a parade passing by. The child's face was bright with wonder. The adults around them were laughing and pointing and sharing food wrapped in paper. It was such a small moment, such an ordinary moment by human standards. But Hand 7, who had spent 3 centuries cataloging the wonders of the universe, found herself adding it to her personal archive. She did not yet know what to call it. But she knew she wanted to see more. Part 2. The tourism board approved the proposal 6 months later. Hand 7 had expected resistance. She had prepared arguments, gathered data, rehearsed her presentation until she could recite it in her sleep. In the end, none of it was necessary. The board watched Pip's recordings in silence, and when the lights came back on, the vote was unanimous. Earth's festivals were now an official intergalactic tourism destination. The first wave of tourists arrived in February, timed to coincide with something the humans called Carnival. 1,200 visitors from 47 different species descended upon a city called. Hand 7 went with them, unable to stay behind, unable to trust this moment to anyone else. She had prepared for problems. The tourism board always prepared for problems. They had medical teams standing by to handle any biological incompatibilities. They had translators equipped with 17,000 human languages. They had cultural advisors who had studied human customs and could explain the significance of various traditions. What they had not prepared for was joy. The problem started almost immediately. The delegation was the first to cause concern. There were beings of crystalline structure, their bodies formed from a mineral that resonated with sound. On their home world, they lived in complete silence, communicating through patterns of light rather than vibration. No one had thought to warn them about samba. When the drums started, they began to hum. It was involuntary, a sympathetic vibration caused by the rhythm of the music. The hum grew louder. The crystals of their bodies began to pulse with light, and then every wine glass within 3 blocks shattered simultaneously. Hand 7 rushed to the scene, expecting chaos. What she found was a group of human musicians gathered around the instruments in hand, experimenting with different rhythms to see what colors they could produce. They were glowing in shades of pink and gold, their crystalline faces arranged in expressions that the translators identified as profound delight. Again, one of them was saying, "Play the fast rhythm again, I want to see what happens." The second incident involved the contingent. They were a warrior species, 8 feet tall and covered in armored scales. Their empire spanned 17 star systems, all of which had been conquered through military force. They were feared throughout the galaxy. They had requested to attend Carnival as part of a diplomatic initiative, a chance to show that their species could engage in peaceful cultural exchange. Hand 7 found them standing on a street corner, surrounded by human children. The children were not afraid. The children were laughing and reaching up to touch the scales, fascinated by the way they glittered in the sunlight. And they were letting them. The fierce warriors who had conquered worlds were standing very still, being very careful not to move too quickly, while small human beings used their scales as mirrors. An elderly human woman pushed through the crowd. She was tiny, barely reaching the chest of the smallest. She was carrying a tray of small brown balls that the translator identified as a traditional Brazilian sweet. "You must be hungry," she said to the, "You have come so far, here, eat." She pressed the sweets into the warrior's massive hands. They looked down at the tiny food, clearly uncertain what to do. The elderly woman reached up and patted the nearest warrior on the arm. "Go on," she said, "I made them myself. Welcome to Brazil." The translator struggled with the last word. It meant something like dear ones or loved ones, a term of endearment from a stranger to the conquerors of star systems. Commander, the leader of the delegation, ate the. His armored face was not designed for human expressions, but something in his posture changed. He looked at the elderly woman, then at the children still playing around his legs, then at the parade passing by in an explosion of color and sound. When Hand 7 approached him later to ask if everything was satisfactory, she found him sitting on a curb, watching the dancers go by. There were tears running down his scaled face. "We conquered 17 systems," he said. "We thought we understood strength. We understood nothing." He would not explain further. The image that circulated through 17 galaxies within hours came from the final night of Carnival. Ambassador X was a dignified elder of the consortium of civilized worlds, a being of ancient lineage and impeccable reputation. He had spent 2 centuries as a diplomat, carefully managing relationships between species that had nothing in common except mutual distrust. The image showed him on top of a parade float, wearing a sequined headdress and feathered wings, dancing with abandon while human dancers cheered him on. His tentacles were wrapped around the waist of a human woman in an elaborate costume. Both of them were laughing. His government demanded an explanation. The message came directly to Hand 7, marked urgent, requiring immediate response. Ambassador X recorded his reply himself. "I cannot explain," he said. His voice was calm, his expression serene. "I can only recommend that you experience it yourself. Bring comfortable shoes." By the time Diwali arrived in November, word had spread. The Intergalactic Tourism Board's booking systems were not designed for the demand they received. When the first images reached the galactic networks, showing entire cities transformed into galaxies of light, the systems crashed completely. 4.7 billion booking requests arrived in a single rotation. The servers had to be rebuilt 3 times. Hand 7 traveled to Earth again for Diwali. She went to a city called Jaipur, where the celebrations were said to be particularly magnificent. Nothing had prepared her for what she found. The city glowed. Every surface, every building, every window and doorway was covered in light. Small clay lamps lined the streets and rooftops, each one a tiny sun against the darkness. Larger displays of electric lights covered entire buildings in patterns of incredible complexity. The air smelled of oil and fire and sweetness, of incense and gunpowder and flowers. And everywhere there were families. Parents and children, grandparents and cousins, neighbors and friends, all gathered together on rooftops and in courtyards, sharing food and lighting fireworks and laughing at the darkness. "What are they celebrating?" asked a tourist standing beside her. He was watching a family light a string of firecrackers, the children covering their ears and shrieking with delighted terror. "The victory of light over darkness," Hand 7 said. "The triumph of good over evil, the return of a hero from exile." She paused, watching the lights reflect in the tourist's wide eyes. "But I think they are also celebrating simply being together, being alive, being able to make light in the darkness." The said nothing. He was crying too hard to speak. Later, he would publish a memoir about his experience. It would become the best-selling book in 12 sectors. The title, translated roughly into Standard Galactic, was "The Night I Learned to Burn." By the end of the first year, everything had changed. Species that had never left their home worlds were booking passages to Earth. Species that had been at war were comparing notes about which festivals they had attended. The hive mind, a collective consciousness that had operated in perfect unity for 10,000 years, reported an unprecedented phenomenon: individual preferences. Different members of the hive had attended different festivals. They had returned with different opinions about which was the best. For the first time in their species' history, they were arguing. The hive's representative contacted the tourism board to express concern. They were not sure if this was a problem or a gift. Hand 7 had no answer for them. She was not sure either. All she knew was that the galaxy was changing, one festival at a time. And she was not sure anyone could stop it now. Part 3. 3 years after the program began, the Intergalactic Tourism Board convened an emergency session. The message that went out to all senior staff contained only 4 words: the human festival problem. Hand 7 arrived at the session to find the chamber packed with representatives from across the galaxy. The High Chancellor of the board presided over the meeting from a raised platform, her ancient face grave with concern. Around her sat ambassadors and scientists, cultural analysts and risk assessors, all of them clutching reports and data tablets and looking worried. "This session will come to order," the High Chancellor said. Her voice was thin with age but still carried the weight of authority. "We are here to discuss the impact of Earth's festival tourism program on galactic society." The reports came one after another. Tourism to Earth had increased by 8,000% since the program began. The economic impact was staggering. New industries had sprung up overnight to meet the demand for human-style celebrations. Hotels and transport companies had expanded beyond all projections. But that was not what worried the board. "The tourists are changing," said a cultural analyst from the monitoring division. She displayed a chart showing behavioral shifts among returning travelers. "They come back different. Their consumption patterns change. Their social relationships change. They express preferences and desires that their species have never shown before." The evidence was everywhere. The silicon-based monoliths of Tau had existed for 50,000 years without ever creating anything decorative. Their architecture was purely functional. Their art was non-existent. After a delegation attended Christmas on Earth, they had returned home and begun constructing trees. Not real trees, but artificial ones, made of crystal and light, decorated with objects that served no purpose except to be beautiful. It was the first decorative structure their species had ever made. The Empire had reorganized its entire military leave system to ensure that soldiers could attend Earth festivals on a rotating basis. The warriors who returned from these trips were different. They still fought when required, but they fought with less enthusiasm. They had begun asking questions about why certain wars were necessary. Morale among new recruits was declining. Commander, the same warrior who had wept at Carnival 3 years earlier, had resigned his military commission entirely. He now ran a small restaurant on the outskirts of his home world, serving food inspired by dishes he had tasted on Earth. The restaurant was always full. But the most troubling report came from the collective. There had been a hive mind for 10,000 years. Every individual was connected to every other individual, sharing thoughts and memories and experiences. There were no secrets among them. There were no individual desires or preferences. There was only the collective, vast and unified and eternal. Until now. "The connection is weakening," reported the representative. Her voice carried undertones of both wonder and fear. "Members who have attended Earth festivals are developing individual identities. They have preferences. They have favorites. They are becoming separate." A murmur went through the chamber. The implications were staggering. The collective was one of the oldest and most stable civilizations in the galaxy. If it was fragmenting, what did that mean for everyone else? The High Chancellor raised a hand for silence. "This is what we must address," she said. "These festivals are changing our citizens in ways we did not predict and cannot control. They are introducing concepts and emotions that some of our species have never known. They are disrupting social structures that have been stable for." She turned to look directly at Hand 7. "You started this program," the High Chancellor said. "What do you have to say?" Hand 7 rose to her feet. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, but now that it had arrived, the words she had planned seemed inadequate. She looked around the chamber at all the worried faces, all the beings who had come seeking answers to a problem they barely understood. "May I share something first?" she asked. The High Chancellor nodded. Hand 7 activated her data tablet. A projection appeared in the center of the chamber, showing a small town in rural Japan. The image showed a harvest festival, modest by Earth standards. A few hundred people gathered in a town square, sharing food and watching traditional dances. "This is a small festival in a place called Nagano," Hand 7 said. "It has been held every year for over 4 centuries. The attendance is limited. The celebrations are simple. By galactic standards, it is completely unremarkable." She changed the projection. Now it showed a warrior standing in the same square, surrounded by elderly humans. The humans were laughing and patting his scaled arms. Someone had put a garland of flowers around his neck. "This is Commander," Hand 7 said. "He has attended this same festival for 7 consecutive years. He travels across the galaxy to reach it. When he arrives, the townspeople greet him by name. They save him a seat at the main table. The children show him the artwork they have made during the year. He brings gifts from his home world, and they display them in the town hall. She paused, letting the image speak for itself. I asked him why, she continued. Why this particular festival? Why this small town when he could attend any celebration on Earth? He told me something that I think is important for this board to hear. She played a recording. Commander's voice filled the chamber. The first year I was a tourist. The second year I was a guest. The third year they remembered my name. Now I am family. They expect me. They worry if I am late. When I leave, they tell me to take care of myself until next year. There was a long silence. We have been thinking about this wrong, Hand 7 said. We marketed these festivals as experiences, attractions to be consumed, entertainment to be sampled, but that is not what they are. She looked around the chamber. They are invitations. The humans have been celebrating for thousands of years, and they have never stopped making room for one more guest. They do not celebrate at the universe. They celebrate with it. They set a place at their table for strangers, and when those strangers return, they set a place for friends. And when those friends keep returning, they set a place for family. The representative spoke up. But we are changing. Our collective is fragmenting. Surely this is a problem. Hand 7 turned to face her. Is it, or is it growth? Your species has been unified for 10,000 years. Perhaps it was time for something new. Perhaps the individuals you are becoming will find ways to connect that your collective never imagined. You cannot know that, the representative said. No, Hand 7 agreed. I cannot, but the humans do not know either. They celebrate without knowing what will happen. They light fireworks without knowing where the sparks will land. They dance without knowing when the music will end. And somehow this uncertainty does not frighten them. It is part of the joy. The High Chancellor leaned forward. What are you suggesting? Hand 7 took a deep breath. I am suggesting that we stop treating this as a problem to be solved. These festivals are changing us, yes, but perhaps we needed to be changed. Perhaps the galaxy has been too orderly for too long. Perhaps we needed humans to show us how to throw powder at each other and dance with fire and stay up all night watching lights in the sky. She returned to her seat. I am suggesting that we designate Earth's festivals as protected galactic heritage, not because they are safe or predictable, but because they are important, because they remind us that there is more to existence than efficiency and order, because joy is worth pursuing, even when it is messy and chaotic and impossible to control. The debate that followed lasted for 7 hours. Representatives argued and questioned and expressed concerns about cultural contamination and social stability. But in the end, when the vote was called, the result was unanimous. Earth's festivals were elevated to protected galactic heritage status. The Tourism Board established a permanent office in Geneva, staffed by a joint committee of humans and aliens. Their mission was not to manage the festivals or control access to them. It was simply to help new visitors find their way to the celebrations that called to them. 1 year later, Hand 7 stood in a place called Times Square on a night the humans called New Year's Eve. Around her, beings from across the galaxy had gathered to watch a glittering ball descend from a tower. The air was cold, but no one seemed to mind. Everyone was pressed together, sharing warmth, sharing food, sharing anticipation. The countdown began. Voices rose from 100 different species, calling out numbers in 100 different languages. The ball dropped. The new year arrived. Fireworks exploded overhead, painting the sky in colors that rivaled the crystal caves of Andromeda Prime. An elderly human woman appeared beside Hand 7. She was bundled in a thick coat, her face wrinkled with age and laughter. She pressed a cup of warm cider into Hand 7's manipulator appendages. First time, the woman asked. Third, Hand 7 said, but it feels like the first every time. The woman smiled. That's how it's supposed to feel. She patted Hand 7's arm with easy familiarity. Welcome back, dear. Happy New Year. Happy New Year, Hand 7 replied. Around them, the crowd was cheering and hugging and crying and laughing. Strangers were kissing. Friends were dancing. Somewhere in the chaos, a was glowing pink and gold, harmonizing with a jazz band. A group of warriors had linked arms with a family from Brooklyn and were attempting to learn something called the Macarena. The elderly woman squeezed Hand 7's arm one more time before disappearing into the crowd. Of course you came back, she called over her shoulder. That's what family does. Hand 7 stood in the middle of Times Square, surrounded by millions of beings who had been strangers an hour ago and would be strangers again by morning. The cider was warm in her manipulators. The fireworks were still painting the sky. The sound of celebration filled the air like music. She thought about the crystal caves of Andromeda Prime and the singing cliffs of Vega 9. She thought about all the wonders she had seen in 300 years of cataloging the galaxy's treasures. None of them compared to this. She added the moment to her personal archive, the same archive she had started 3 years ago when she first saw humans dance around a burning wooden figure in a desert. The archive was larger now. It contained thousands of entries, festivals and celebrations and small moments of connection, tears shed by warriors, songs sung by crystalline beings, children lifted onto shoulders to see parades, strangers offering food to travelers from distant stars. She had been labeling each entry individually, trying to capture what made each one special. But now she realized they all belonged under the same heading. She updated the archive with a single word that contained everything she had learned. Home.